The factory floor trembled with the sound of 1,000 machines devouring metal. Sparks burst and vanished like dying stars, smoke hung thick and gray above the workers, and the air reeked of oil and iron. In a dim corner of the shop, a man worked apart from the others, his hands dark with soot, his eyes reflecting the orange fire of the welding torch. His name was Otto Hartmann, and everyone called him the Mad Welder. Otto barely noticed the noise around him anymore. The hammering of rivets, the shouts of foremen, the hiss of molten steel, all of it blended into a rhythm he'd long since memorized. What he heard instead was the faint hum of possibility. On the workbench before him lay a collection of crude metal plates, welded into the rough outline of something that looked more like a plumber's tool than a weapon. He tightened a bolt, stepped back, and studied it. It was ugly. Even he could see that. The handle was awkward, the frame uneven, the barrel squat and graceless. But it was light, half the weight of a Thompson, and it could be built in hours, not days. The others saw a toy, Otto saw a revolution. He turned off the torch and lifted the weapon carefully. The steel was still warm. He sighted down the barrel, imagining soldiers holding it, men who wouldn't have to lug heavy, expensive guns across mud and rubble. A weapon made not by artisans, but by welders. By men like him. "Still building your toys, Otto?" came a voice behind him. He turned to see Bill Tanner, one of the foremen, grinning under a film of grease. Tanner was a big man, arms like cables, always laughing at something. "Not toys," Otto said quietly. His English still carried the hard edge of his German accent. "Improvements." Tanner chuckled and leaned against the bench. "You and your improvements. You think the army wants this kind of junk? Look at it, it's crooked. Hell, it looks like it came out of a drain pipe." "It works," Otto said, a little too quickly. Tanner smirked. "Sure it does. And I'm the president." He pushed off the bench and clapped Otto on the shoulder. "Come on, pal. You're a good welder. Leave the inventing to the engineers." When Tanner walked away, Otto stared after him until the man's laughter was swallowed by the machinery. He looked down at the gun again. Maybe Tanner was right. Maybe no one would ever understand what he was trying to do. But he couldn't stop. Not after everything he'd left behind. He had once been a gunsmith in Munich, a quiet craftsman in a small shop above the Isar River. He remembered the crisp mornings, the smell of the river, the sound of church bells echoing over rooftops. Then came the parades. The uniforms. The voices shouting in unison. And the night they burned books in the square. He had watched from his window as the flames painted the sky red. That night, he packed a suitcase and didn't look back. Now, in a Connecticut factory surrounded by men who thought him strange, Otto welded his penance into steel. He wasn't building for power anymore. He was building to stop it. He wrapped the weapon in a cloth and carried it home after his shift. His apartment was small, the wallpaper yellowed, the furniture worn. On the table lay a letter half-written to his mother. He hadn't sent one in years. He unfolded it and read the last line he'd written, "Maybe I can build something that will stop them." He sighed and set it aside. No letter could cross that ocean now. He sat by the window and stared out at the street below. America was still peaceful, children playing, streetcars rattling, men in hats reading newspapers on corners. But Otto could feel the tension in the air, like a wire stretched too tight. Europe was burning, and he could almost hear the fire from here. He fell asleep at the table, his hands still black with soot. The next morning, he carried the prototype to his supervisor's office. The man behind the desk, Mr. Daniels, was middle-aged, with thinning hair and the weary patience of someone used to dealing with dreamers. "So this is the project you've been hiding from us," Daniels said, lifting the weapon from its cloth. He turned it over, frowning. "Looks like it fell off a truck." "It can be made in 4 hours," Otto said, standing stiffly. No machining, only welding and stamping. Cheap metal. Easy to build. Anyone can do it. Daniels raised an eyebrow. And this thing shoots? Yes, sir. Daniel sighed and glanced at his assistant. Get the ordnance rep down here. Let's see if the mad welder's toy makes noise. They took it to the test range behind the factory. The day was gray and windless. Otto loaded the weapon himself, hands trembling. He aimed at a paper target 50 yards away and pulled the trigger. The gun barked 3 times. Then jammed. Daniels rubbed his temples. The ordnance officer, a clean-shaven man with brass buttons and little patience, took the weapon, cleared the jam, and fired again. This time it spat an uneven burst before coughing to silence. Interesting concept, the officer said flatly. But it's not reliable. And it's ugly as sin. The army's not going to issue something that looks like a plumber made it. Otto felt his face flush. It can be improved. I'm sure it can, the officer interrupted. But we're not looking for experiments, Mr. Hartmann. We're looking for results. He handed the gun back and turned away. Daniels patted Otto on the arm. Good try, son. Now get back to your station before Tanner blows a gasket. Otto stood there a long moment, staring at the target. The paper was torn in 3 neat holes. Not perfect, but enough. Enough to prove it worked. That night he stayed in the factory after hours. The others had gone home, the machines were silent, and the floor smelled of warm oil. He stripped the gun apart and began again. Filing, reshaping, rewelding. He talked to himself as he worked. They want beauty, he muttered. They want shine. They forget war does not care for shine. The metal glowed red under his torch. Sweat ran down his neck. Somewhere deep in the factory, a steam line hissed like a whispering ghost. He didn't hear Tanner come in. Christ, Otto, you're still here? Tanner said softly. You'll burn yourself alive one of these nights. Otto didn't look up. I have to finish this. Why? Nobody's buying it. Because I know what is coming. Otto lifted his mask and stared at him. You think America is safe? That we can hide from what is happening over there? No. The fire spreads. Always it spreads. Tanner frowned. You worry too much. Otto smiled thinly. I have seen what happens when you stop worrying. Tanner didn't answer. He watched Otto work for a while, the sparks dancing across the floor. Then he left quietly. Weeks passed. News drifted in from overseas, Poland invaded, France trembling, London bracing for bombs. The papers sold out before noon every day. Otto read every headline until the ink stained his fingers. He took the prototype to the range again. This time it fired 5, 10, 15 rounds before jamming. He reloaded, adjusted, tested again. When the barrel overheated, he dunked it in oil and kept going. When his hands blistered, he wrapped them in rags. The weapon began to take shape, not pretty, but purposeful. He began sending letters to the Ordnance Department, each one describing the gun's potential for mass production. He never received a reply. The foreman laughed when they found out. One morning, Daniels called him into the office again. Otto, you've been here 6 years. You're a good worker. But I need you to stop wasting time on this thing. It is not waste, Otto said. It's a distraction, Daniels snapped. You want to help the army? Weld the parts they pay you for. Otto looked down at his hands. They were scarred, cracked, gray with metal dust. I will, he said softly. But I will also build this. Daniels sighed. You Germans. Always stubborn. Otto nodded once. That is why we survive. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain hammered the factory roof. The power flickered. Otto stayed long after closing, alone with the thunder. He held the weapon in his lap, listening to the sky rumble. The noise reminded him of artillery, the same low growl he'd heard years ago when the German army marched through the streets of Munich. He closed his eyes and saw faces, his mother waving from the station platform, his brother in uniform, the men shouting Sieg Heil beneath burning banners. He saw what the world was becoming. And he whispered to the rain, "Not again." He placed the weapon on the table beside his letter to his mother. The candlelight trembled across the metal. For a moment it almost looked beautiful. He picked up his pen and wrote a final line, "They call me mad. But if madness builds what reason rejects, then let me be mad forever." The storm raged on, shaking the windows. He didn't sleep. By dawn, he was back at the factory, face pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He worked through the day, through the next, through the week. Every weld brought him closer to something only he could see. Then one morning, the factory's radio crackled with a voice, news from Europe. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. No one laughed at Otto that day. The workers gathered around the radio in silence. The announcer's voice quivered as he described cities reduced to ash, refugees flooding the countryside, ships sunk off the coast. When the broadcast ended, Otto looked at Tanner, who was staring at the floor. "You see?" he said quietly. Tanner nodded, wordless. Otto picked up his welding torch. "Now they will listen." He returned to his bench and began to work, the torch roaring to life like a miniature sun. The others drifted back to their stations, glancing his way now and then. No one called him mad anymore. By evening, his prototype was ready again, stronger, simpler, refined. He held it in both hands and smiled faintly. He didn't know when, or how, or if the army would ever use it. But he knew the world would soon need weapons that were quick to make and easy to trust. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the smokestacks. The factory shadows stretched long and dark across the floor. Otto stood at the doorway, the gun wrapped in cloth beneath his arm. The air smelled of iron and rain. Somewhere across the ocean, bombs were already falling. He tightened his grip on the weapon and whispered to himself, "It begins." Then he stepped into the twilight, a lone figure carrying an idea no one believed in, yet. The factory no longer slept. By 1942, every hour belonged to war. The windows rattled with the pulse of machinery, the sky above the Connecticut Valley glowed orange each night, a man-made sunrise born of flame and steel. America had entered the furnace. Otto Hartmann worked 16 hours a day now. The war that had haunted his dreams had arrived, and with it, a new kind of madness, organized, industrial, relentless. The machines that once made tools now birthed weapons. Women welded beside men, their hands steady, their faces streaked with soot. The factory smelled of sweat and oil and burning determination. The radio on the wall shouted headlines over the roar of production. Pearl Harbor attacked. The Pacific in flames. Factories to double output. The words sank into the rhythm of hammering and welding until even catastrophe sounded like another shift order. Otto no longer had to hide his invention. Now, the army wanted everything that could fire a bullet. Every engineer, machinist, and dreamer was suddenly important, provided they could deliver fast. One morning, as the whistle screamed the start of another shift, Mr. Daniels called Otto into his office. The man looked older, thinner, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. On his desk lay a stack of requisition papers and a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. "They're asking for designs again," Daniels said. "Anything cheaper than the Thompson. They can't make them fast enough. Too expensive, too slow." Otto said nothing. Daniels rubbed his temples. "I told them about your project." Otto's heart kicked. "You did?" Daniels shrugged. Desperate times. There's a captain coming from ordnance tomorrow. Bring your prototype. Try not to scare him. That night, Otto worked in silence long after the others had gone. He cleaned the metal with slow, deliberate care, polishing the crude lines as best he could. The gun was still plain, flat gray steel, welded seams visible like scars, but it was reliable now. It fired straight. It fired clean. He thought of the soldiers who would hold it. Boys, most of them. Untrained, frightened, sent to fight men who had been preparing for years. He tightened a bolt and whispered, "I will not let you down." The next morning, Captain James Sullivan arrived in a cloud of cigarette smoke and urgency. He was young, with dark hair slicked back and a manner too restless for the small office. He looked at everything once, then zeroed in on the gun resting on the desk. "So this is it," he said. "The infamous grease gun." "That name was not mine," Otto said. Sullivan grinned. "Doesn't matter. Soldiers will call it worse. Show me what it can do." At the range, Otto loaded a magazine and handed it over. Sullivan turned the weapon over in his hands. "Feels light," he said. "It is. 6 pounds. Half the Thompson's weight. And you say anyone can build this?" "With training, a welder could make 10 a day." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim." "War does not wait for pride," Otto said. Sullivan fired. The gun barked, steady and low. The recoil was minimal, the rounds tore through the target with clean precision. When the magazine clicked empty, he lowered it and exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Well, I'll be damned." He turned to Daniels. "Why wasn't this approved years ago?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "The design was unconventional." Sullivan snorted. "Unconventional is what wins wars. We'll take it to Washington." For the first time in years, Otto allowed himself a smile. In the weeks that followed, the prototype traveled faster than he did, testing ranges, military boards, manufacturing offices. Reports came back stamped with cautious praise. Simple construction. Reliable under stress. Ideal for mass production. Then came the resistance. Traditionalists hated it. "It looks cheap," one colonel said. "The men won't trust a weapon that looks like a toy." Another called it an insult to American craftsmanship. They wanted polish, elegance, prestige, the kind of gun you could frame in a museum when the war was done. But Sullivan fought for it. He argued in every meeting, waved performance charts, slammed his fist on tables. "You don't need a work of art," he shouted once, "you need something a farmhand can build in a barn." Otto sat silently at the end of the table, listening as others judged the worth of his creation. Each word felt like a blow, but Sullivan's defiance gave him strength. Finally, a general with iron-gray hair leaned forward and said, "If it works, we'll make it. God knows we need more guns." That was all it took. Production began within a month. The factory changed overnight. Old machines were stripped, new dies installed, lines rearranged. Men and women learned new motions, faster motions. The air thickened with heat and dust. Otto stood at the center of it all, watching the first stamped frames roll down the line. The workers joked, cursed, and wiped sweat from their faces, but the rhythm never stopped. The grease gun, his grease gun, was being born by the thousands. Tanner passed him one day, carrying a crate of parts. "Looks like they finally saw it your way, Otto." Otto nodded, eyes on the assembly line. They saw war's way. As days bled into nights, the plant became a world of its own. There were no weekends, no holidays, only deadlines. The workers moved like soldiers in their own battle, armed with torches and hammers. Posters on the walls shouted "Speed wins." And more guns, fewer graves. Otto walked the aisles each night after the shift ended, running his fingers over the cooling metal. He still thought about Germany, about his mother, about the city that had driven him out. He wondered if somewhere in the smoke of Europe, another man like him was building weapons for the opposite cause. The thought made him sick. One evening, Sullivan returned from Washington with a telegram in hand. He waved it like a flag. "Approved," he shouted. "The M3 is official. First shipments go to North Africa next month." The factory erupted in cheers. Tanner threw his cap into the air. Someone uncorked a bottle of contraband whiskey. Otto stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed, uncertain. He had dreamed of this moment, and feared it too. Sullivan clapped him on the back. "You did it, old man." Otto smiled faintly. "No. We did it." The celebration lasted only minutes before the whistles called them back. Production couldn't stop, not even for triumph. Weeks later, as the first crates were loaded onto trains, Otto watched the workers seal them with thick straps and stencils, U.S. Army property. He touched one crate lightly, tracing the letters with a gloved finger. Inside lay hundreds of his guns, each one a piece of him. "Will they really work?" Tanner asked quietly beside him. "They will," Otto said. "And if they don't? Then I will rebuild them until they do." The train whistle howled. The cars began to move, clattering into the night. Otto stood until they vanished. He didn't notice Sullivan watching him from a distance. That night, the captain found him in the workshop, staring at a new prototype on the table, a refinement, smoother and lighter. Sullivan lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall. "You don't stop, do you?" Otto didn't look up. "War does not stop." "True enough." Sullivan exhaled smoke. "You know, I think you're saving lives with this thing." Otto's hands froze over the steel. "And taking them." Sullivan frowned. "That's not on you. Isn't it?" Otto turned toward him. "Every bullet that leaves this barrel carries my work. Every man it kills, somewhere his mother waits, as mine waited for me." The captain hesitated. "That's war, Otto. It isn't clean. It never was." Otto nodded slowly. "Then perhaps we should not make it so easy." Neither spoke after that. The torch hissed to life again, filling the silence with its blue light. In the months that followed, reports began arriving from overseas. Letters, field notes, fragments of praise and complaint. Lightweight. Reliable. Fires under mud and rain. Others said, ugly, but it works. Otto collected every note in a small wooden box, reading them at night before sleep. Each one was proof that his hands had reached across oceans. But one report chilled him. "Enemy captured our weapons and are using them against us." He stared at the paper until the words blurred. The irony struck like a knife. His creation was so simple that even the enemy could copy it. In the logic of war, success was indistinguishable from betrayal. Still, he worked. There was no other choice. The factory grew louder, hotter. Overtime became endless. Men fainted from exhaustion, women coughed up black dust, but no one complained. They all believed the same thing: if they worked faster, maybe someone's son would come home sooner. One night, the air raid siren blared, a test drill, but the sound froze everyone in place. The long, mournful wail carried them somewhere else, across the ocean, to burning cities and broken streets. When it ended, silence filled the plant. Otto removed his goggles and looked around at the faces of his fellow workers, young, old, frightened, determined. He saw in them what he had once seen in the streets of Munich, people holding on to hope by the thinnest thread. "Back to work," someone whispered, and the machines roared to life again. That winter, snow fell over the factory yard, muffling the usual clamor. Otto stood by the loading docks, watching another train depart. Sullivan joined him, collar turned up against the wind. "They're saying this thing's saving time like nothing else," Sullivan said. 50 million man-hours across the board. "You've built a miracle, Otto." Otto smiled faintly, eyes on the departing cars. "No. Just a tool. Miracles do not kill." The captain looked at him, uncertain how to answer. The whistle blew again, long and hollow, echoing across the frozen yard. "Ever wonder," Sullivan said finally, "what happens to men like us when it's over?" Otto's gaze followed the trail of smoke rising into the pale sky. "If we are lucky," he said, "we learn to build something else." The captain nodded, though neither believed it. As they walked back inside, the sound of the factory rose once more, endless, merciless, alive. It was the heartbeat of a nation at war, pounding through the bones of every man and woman who stood beneath its roof. And somewhere, beneath that thunder, Otto could almost hear the echo of his own creation, crossing oceans, speaking in bursts of fire and smoke. He paused by the door and looked back at the glowing horizon. The furnaces burned brighter than ever, painting the clouds red. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. The war's furnace was in full blaze now, and he knew it would not cool for a long, long time. He turned away and went back to his bench. Tomorrow, there would be new blueprints, new deadlines, new demands. But tonight, as the sparks leapt once more into the dark, Otto Hartmann felt the uneasy weight of both triumph and dread settling in his chest. He had built exactly what the world wanted, and perhaps everything it would one day regret. The wind off the channel was cold enough to taste like iron. Sergeant Thomas Miller crouched behind the wreck of a landing craft, his fingers wrapped tight around the small, gray weapon resting against his chest. Smoke curled off the sand, mingling with the screams and thunder of Normandy. The sea was red and alive. He checked the magazine again, though he'd already done it 3 times. The weapon was lighter than any gun he'd carried before, an awkward, boxy thing that looked like it had been made in a garage. The men had laughed when they first saw it. "What is that, Miller?" "A grease pump," one of them had joked. The name stuck. But now, as shells burst over the cliffs, nobody was laughing. He pressed his cheek against the cold metal and whispered, "Don't jam on me." Then he rose and fired. The weapon spat fire, low, steady, obedient. German silhouettes fell against the dunes. The recoil was soft, the rhythm constant. It shouldn't have worked this well, he thought. It shouldn't have worked at all. By the time the shooting died down, Miller's unit was scattered among the dunes. The air stank of burnt powder and seawater. He sat down hard, chest heaving, the gun resting across his knees. For the first time, he noticed the faint stamp on its side, M3 submachine gun, General Motors, USA. He brushed the grit off the letters. It looked too humble, too unassuming for the chaos it had survived. He didn't know that halfway across the ocean, in a factory half lit by welding torches, Otto Hartmann was listening to a radio broadcast of that same invasion, his heart caught somewhere between pride and dread. The announcer's voice crackled through the static. "Allied troops have landed on the beaches of France." The factory around him was quieter now, the war pulling men overseas, production slowing as resources shifted. But Otto still worked late, polishing the rough edges off the weapon that had become his legacy. When he heard the words, Normandy, he set down his tools. His hands were trembling. For years he had imagined this day, the moment when his invention would find its purpose. But purpose, he realized, was a dangerous thing. Every round fired was proof that he had succeeded. Every body that fell was proof that he had. He turned off the radio and sat in silence. The machine oil on his hands smelled faintly sweet, almost like blood. In Normandy, Miller's unit pushed inland. The countryside was a graveyard of hedgerows and ruined barns. Rain soaked everything, helmets, rations, letters from home. The mud swallowed their boots. But the little gun never faltered. When Thompsons jammed, when carbines clogged, Miller's M3 kept firing. One night, Huddled under a tarp as rain drummed above, Corporal Davis said, "You still carrying that tin can, Miller?" "Yeah," Miller muttered. Davis grinned. "You know, rumor is it was designed by some crazy German working for us. Ain't that a kick?" Miller looked at the gun in his lap. "Crazy or not, he built something that works." "Maybe that's what it takes," Davis said. "A little madness." They fell asleep to the distant hum of artillery. Back in Connecticut, Otto received the first field reports. Typed summaries, stamped with approval, shipped across oceans in brown envelopes. Weapon reliable under combat conditions. Effective in close quarters. Minor complaints, unsightly design. He read them by lamplight, the paper trembling between his fingers. He underlined the word reliable 3 times, then set the report aside. There were other letters too, written by hand, some from officers, some from soldiers. He read every one. "Dear Sir," one began. "We used your gun in the push through Corentin. It kept firing when everything else failed. Tell your boys in the factory, they built something that stayed alive when we almost didn't." Otto folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with the others. There were dozens now, each one a small voice reaching out from the chaos. Yet for every note of gratitude, he imagined a shadow on the other side, someone's son, brother, or father lying still because of the same invention. He began sleeping less. The night stretched long and colorless. Sometimes, as he closed his eyes, he could hear the gunfire through the walls, faint and distant, like an echo from another world. Miller's world grew smaller with every mile. The villages they passed through were little more than rubble. Windows shattered, doors blown inward, the smell of death lingering in every corner. They fought through one town after another until even the names blurred together. Once, in a rain-soaked field near St. Lo, Miller found himself face to face with a German soldier no older than 17. Both froze. The boy's eyes were wide, terrified. Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun fired before he could think. The boy fell, the weapon clattering from his hands. Miller stood there for a long time, staring at what he'd done. The rain fell harder. When Davis caught up to him, he said nothing. They both knew words couldn't reach that far. That night, Miller sat alone, cleaning the gun. He ran a cloth over the barrel, over the scratches and dents, over the metal that had become part of him. It was ugly, crude, and unstoppable. He whispered, "You just keep working, don't you?" In the factory, Otto was breaking down. His health had begun to fade, nights without sleep, meals skipped, a cough that rattled his chest. Sullivan visited when he could, but the captain looked changed too, older, wearier, hollowed out by what he'd seen overseas. "They love your gun," Sullivan said one afternoon, trying to smile. "Saved lives, Otto. Thousands of them." Otto didn't look up from his workbench. "And took how many?" Sullivan sighed. "That's not on you. You gave them a chance to fight back." "A chance to kill better," Otto murmured. The captain shook his head. "You can't carry that weight." "I must," Otto said softly. "Someone must." Sullivan didn't argue. He knew there were no words strong enough to move that kind of guilt. Weeks later, the war pushed deeper into France. Miller's unit was sent to guard a bridge near the Seine. They held it for 3 days under constant fire. The M3 never jammed. When the Germans retreated, only half of Miller's men were still standing. As the smoke cleared, he sat beside the river, staring at the gun resting in the mud. He wanted to throw it in, to let the current take it away, but his hands wouldn't open. He had come to trust it too much. Dependence was another kind of prison. When they returned to camp, he wrote a letter to no one in particular: "Whoever built this thing, thank you. It's not pretty, but neither is war. You made something that doesn't quit." That letter found its way, weeks later, into Otto's trembling hands. He read it twice, then again. It was unsigned, the handwriting smudged and uneven. But it felt like a confession shared between two men who would never meet. He placed it on the workbench beside the others, then picked up the prototype. The edges were worn smooth, the metal darkened from years of handling. He traced the lines with a fingertip. "You never quit," he whispered. The war pressed on. New orders came, more guns, faster output. But something had changed in Otto. He worked slower now, each weld deliberate, almost reverent. The factory foreman noticed, but no one dared confront him. He had become a relic in his own creation, the ghost of the machine he'd built. Then came the telegram that stopped him cold: Captain James Sullivan killed in action, France. Otto sat for hours, staring at the slip of paper. The words refused to sink in. Sullivan had been his bridge to the outside world, his defender against the brass, his proof that humanity could exist even in war. Now that bridge was gone. He stood and walked out into the night air. The factory yard was empty, moonlight glinting off stacks of unshipped crates. He opened one, touched the cold steel inside. Dozens of guns lay packed in rows, their muzzles pointed nowhere and everywhere. He whispered, "I built these to save time. Not to erase it." The next morning, he returned to work without a word. No one mentioned the telegram. The machines roared on, indifferent. In France, the war's tide turned. Miller's unit crossed the Rhine that winter. They moved like ghosts through snow and smoke, their faces carved by exhaustion. He'd lost count of the men buried along the way. The M3 still fired true. On a frozen road outside Cologne, a sniper's bullet caught Davis in the throat. Miller dragged him into a ditch, blood soaking the snow. Davis gasped once, tried to speak, then went still. Miller stared at him, then at the gun in his hand. His grip tightened until his knuckles went white. When the sniper fired again, Miller rose and returned fire. The M3 coughed twice, clean and final. The enemy slumped from the window. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Later, when they buried Davis, Miller left his helmet by the grave and whispered, "I told you it works." Somewhere across the ocean, Otto awoke that same night from a dream he couldn't remember. He went to his workbench and sat in the half-dark, surrounded by the smell of oil and ash. The world had become a vast forge, and he its unwilling blacksmith. He reached for the radio and turned it on. A reporter was speaking from Paris, liberated, finally. Crowds in the streets, laughter, flags waving. Otto listened without smiling. Victory had come, but it sounded hollow. He turned off the radio and whispered to the empty room, "You shouldn't have worked." The machines in the factory next door clanged and echoed, building, always building. Otto sat there until dawn, the light creeping across the floor, glinting off the weapon that bore his name. In France, Miller's unit received word that the war in Europe was almost over. The men didn't cheer. They simply stared at each other, unsure what to feel. Miller looked down at the gun in his lap, the same battered M3 that had carried him through every battle, and wondered what would become of it now. He thought of all the lives it had taken, all the ones it had saved. He thought of the hands that had made it, the mind that had imagined it. Somewhere, he was certain, that man was as tired as he was. When the sun rose, Miller slung the gun over his shoulder and kept walking. Behind him, the world was still smoking. Ahead lay silence. And in that silence, across oceans and years, Otto Hartmann's creation kept echoing, a weapon born of desperation, carried by survivors, cursed by its own success. The war was not yet over, but the weapon that shouldn't have worked had done its part. And both men, one who built it, one who carried it, knew that when the fighting stopped, neither would ever be the same again. The war ended not with fanfare, but with silence. Across Europe, smoke rose from the ruins like ghosts unwilling to leave. Cities were skeletons, fields scarred by craters, and men, those who survived, wandered through the wreckage, unsure what to do with peace. Sergeant Thomas Miller stood among them, the M3 still slung over his shoulder, its gray metal dulled by years of grime and blood. He hadn't fired it in weeks, yet he couldn't bring himself to let it go. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Papers called it victory, but Miller couldn't feel it. Victory meant going home, but what was home now? He had changed too much, lost too much. The faces of the dead followed him even in daylight. At night, he dreamed of the boy by the river, of Davis bleeding into snow, of every moment that smelled of gunpowder and fear. He'd wake up sweating, his hands searching for the gun like a talisman. It was more than a weapon now, it was his proof that he had survived when others hadn't. The orders came, demobilization. Soldiers would be shipped back in waves. Miller packed his duffel and stood in the long line at the docks. Around him, men talked about girls, beer, jobs, trying to sound alive again. He said nothing. The M3 rested in the bag at his feet, the same ugly little gun that had never failed him. When the quartermaster asked him to turn it in, Miller hesitated. "I'd like to keep it," he said quietly. The man frowned. "Sorry, Sergeant. Government property." Miller nodded, his throat tightening. He placed it on the counter. The quartermaster didn't even glance at it, just tagged it and shoved it into a crate with hundreds of others. The sound of it landing among the metal echoed in Miller's chest like a door closing. When he boarded the ship home, he felt lighter, but not freer. The waves rolled beneath him, endless and indifferent. He stared at the horizon, wondering if the man who had built that weapon was still alive. Whoever he was, Miller wanted to thank him, and curse him in the same breath. Thousands of miles away, in Detroit, Otto Hartmann walked through the factory one last time. The war contracts had ended. The machines were still, the air strangely empty without the hum of production. Dust had begun to gather on the assembly lines that once breathed steel and fire. The workers were gone, replaced by silence. He stopped at his old station, where the first prototype had been welded together from scrap. The memory came back so vividly it hurt, Sullivan's laughter, the sparks flying, the first time the mechanism actually fired without jamming. For a moment, Otto could almost hear the clang of hammers again. He sat down on the bench, his joints aching. His cough had worsened. The doctors said his lungs were failing, a slow poisoning from years of smoke and metal fumes. He didn't care. There were worse ways to die than surrounded by the ghosts of your own making. The door creaked open. A young factory clerk stepped in, startled to find him there. "Mr. Hartmann?" "Sir, we're closing up for good today." "I know," Otto said, smiling faintly. "Just wanted to say goodbye." The clerk hesitated, then handed him a small envelope. "This came for you. Military return post." Otto turned it over. The paper was creased, the ink faded. Inside was a single photograph, a group of soldiers posing on a bridge, their faces smeared with dirt and triumph. In the front, holding an M3 like it was a sacred relic, was a man Otto didn't know. On the back, scrawled in rough handwriting, were 3 words, "It never failed." Otto stared at it for a long time. His hands trembled as he traced the outline of the weapon in the picture. "You made it," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the soldier or himself. He folded the photo and placed it in his coat pocket, next to Sullivan's old badge. Then he walked outside. The sun was setting over Detroit, painting the smokestacks gold. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace. But peace, like war, never lasts. In the months that followed, Otto faded from the world. His health deteriorated quickly. The papers wrote about generals, scientists, and presidents, but not about welders. The name Otto Hartmann vanished into the margins of history, buried beneath the noise of progress. The M3, however, lived on. It became the standard weapon of countless armies, its design refined, copied, and renamed. The men who had once laughed at it now praised its simplicity. It was a marvel of efficiency, they said, a tool that saved time, saved lives. But no one remembered the man who built it out of desperation, who bled for every inch of its perfection. Miller returned to Ohio, to a home that felt smaller than he remembered. His mother had aged years during the war, the town had changed, too, factories booming, parades marching, flags waving, everyone wanted to forget the blood behind the victory. He tried to fit back in. He found work at a repair shop, fixing engines, welding parts. The smell of oil and metal followed him home every night. Sometimes, when the sparks flew from his torch, he'd see the flash of gunfire in his mind. The sound of the arc made him flinch. One evening, he was cleaning out an old supply crate that had come from a surplus auction. Inside, wrapped in canvas, was a familiar shape. He froze. His heart began to pound. He unwrapped it slowly. The metal was dull, scratched, but unmistakable, the same M3 he'd turned in months ago. His initials were still carved faintly near the trigger guard. He stared at it in disbelief, then smiled for the first time in months. It felt like fate, like the war reaching back to remind him of what he'd survived. He hung it above his workbench, not as a weapon, but as a memory. Every time he looked at it, he thought about the men who never came home, and the unseen hands that had built the tool that kept him alive. Years passed. The gun gathered dust. The world moved on, to new wars, new machines, new inventions. The M3 became obsolete, then forgotten, relegated to museums and footnotes. Children called it clumsy, old-fashioned. They never knew how much history pulsed inside that crude steel frame. One summer afternoon, a young journalist visited Miller's garage. She was researching a book about the hidden inventions of World War II. When she spotted the gun on the wall, she gasped. "Is that an original M3? Miller nodded. "Used it myself. Normandy, France, the whole way through." "Do you know who designed it?" she asked. He hesitated. "Only heard rumors. Some welder. Name never stuck." She scribbled in her notebook, her eyes bright with curiosity. "If I find him, or what's left of his story, I'll let you know." He smiled faintly. "If you do, tell him thanks. Tell him, it worked." Months later, she sent him a letter. Inside was a clipping from an old engineering journal, dated 1945. The headline read, "Otto Hartmann, the quiet genius behind America's simplest gun." Beneath it was a grainy photograph of a man with tired eyes and a soot-stained face, sitting beside a welding rig. Miller ran a thumb over the image. The man looked older than he probably was, worn down by years of smoke and guilt. But his expression was gentle, almost humble. He pinned the article beside the gun. The two belonged together. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Miller sat alone in the workshop. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet he used to pray for during the war. He looked at the gun, at the faded photograph, and whispered, "You saved more than you'll ever know." Across the years, it felt as if the silence answered. In Detroit, the factory where Otto had once worked was long abandoned. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered. But on one rusted beam, faint beneath the dust, someone had once scratched a line with a welding rod, built to save time. No one could tell whether it was meant as pride or confession. History moved on, as it always does, forgetting the names that built its foundations. But sometimes, in the right light, in the echo of a workshop, you could almost hear the hiss of the torch, the hum of creation, the rhythm of a man trying to turn madness into mercy. Miller died years later, old and gray, the M3 still hanging on the wall. His family found it after the funeral, along with the article about Otto. They donated both to a small museum. The curator placed the weapon in a glass case, beneath a simple plaque. The M3 grease gun. Designed by Otto Hartmann, 1942. Used by Sergeant Thomas Miller, 1944-45. A weapon born of necessity, carried through chaos, remembered in silence. Visitors rarely stopped to read the full description. Most passed it by, drawn to the flashier exhibits, the tanks, the uniforms, the medals. But sometimes, a veteran would linger, eyes tracing the crude lines of the gun, recognizing something unspoken in its simplicity. And somewhere, perhaps beyond time, two men stood side by side, the welder and the soldier, bound by the same creation. One had built to save lives, the other had survived because of it. In the end, neither was remembered as a hero. But both were something rarer, necessary. The gun that shouldn't have worked had done its duty. And the man who built it, forgotten by history, had saved millions of moments of life, one weld, one shot, one breath at a time. Because sometimes salvation doesn't roar. It hums softly in the hands of the lost, working quietly until the world no longer needs it.